If you were hanging around here a couple of months ago, you'll remember when I decorated my updated Coconut Mall model for Halloween. That was one of the funnest projects that I've ever taken on, and it turned out pretty awesome. So I figured, why not do the same for Christmas? So I opened Coconut Mall again and found that the mountains were invisible this time. You know, while the ghost ship was a pretty good idea for the Halloween track, ghost mountains aren't really gonna work here. So I'll just make those opaque again. And unfortunately, I've made the mistake of saving while all of the light collections are still active, which took about 3 minutes. So let's hide those lights and only activate them when we need to. And it seems like the Pianta over here is missing a texture, so I relocated that to the new folder and selected it. But now there's some weird thing going on. I was pretty sure that this was because something was wrong with the custom split normals, but nothing I did was fixing it. That was until I set the normal map strength to 0. That tells me that it's the normal map causing the issues, so I went into the shader editor and found that the normal map was set to sRGB instead of non-color. A pretty rookie mistake that I'm surprised is still getting me. So the first thing I want to do is set up a skybox and some HDR lighting. I want it to feel cold and snowy before I even add any snow. What's that? There shouldn't be snow on a tropical ocean front? Well then what exactly do you make of this image? Alright, I think this is good. Now we just need some snow. There's only one issue. I don't know how to do any of that. The first thing I tried was just adding a snow material to the tops of some surfaces, which looked alright, but I want some actual 3D snow sitting on top and giving more height to these surfaces. And after some searching online, I found out that Blender has a snow add-on, which should just automatically generate some nice snow, or it'll do that. So I scaled my model up a decent bit so that the snow would be smaller, and I tried it out on the tops of the palm trees. It was kinda messy looking though, but the snow looked much better on everything else now that the model is bigger. And with the lighting, this is turning into a good base for something Christmassy. After shoveling a bunch of glitchy snow, I took a different approach to the snow on the palm trees. Instead of generating snow on the leaves, I just duplicated them, put the snow material on the duplicate, and used the shrink wrap modifier to have these snow coverings sit just above the leaves. That's a lot better. Next, I'm gonna go ahead and repaint this place, which is as simple as putting the wall materials in Photoshop and doing a couple of color overlays on them. And now we've got a snow-covered green and red Coconut Mall, but the snow isn't quite convincing enough, so I'm gonna sprinkle some onto the concrete and road, which I did by throwing the materials into Photoshop and using a spray brush on them. This looks a lot snowier now. Well, let's recolor that Coconut Mall entrance sign. Luckily, this uses a color palette texture, so I can just move parts of the mesh around on the palette to change the colors. And this palette already has just the colors I was looking for. But now that the sign's updated, this Pianta isn't quite festive enough. I want to do some kind of Santa Pianta, but I'll hold off on that for now. First, I'm gonna download a bunch of Mario Kart 8 winter and Christmas models. I'd like to just have everything that I might want to reuse sitting in one place. So I went through a few tracks like Merry Mountain and found things that could come in handy. Then I renamed them with an exclamation point at the beginning to get them to sit at the top of the hierarchy. That way they're easier to find. And when I was done, I just put Merry Mountain into a collection and disabled it. I can keep doing this in this separate Blender project until I've gone through every track that I've downloaded. Then I'll line the objects up side by side and remove color palette textures from anything that uses them. I'm sure I've already got enough color palettes in Coconut Mall to accommodate these new items. Then I can copy this row of items and place it into my Coconut Mall Blender project. Now I can set up color palettes on things that use them, and for the other objects, I can move their textures to this project's texture folder. Now I've got a whole bunch of new objects to play around with. It's almost like opening Christmas presents. The first thing that I used was the Merry Mountain start gate, which I sort of just pasted on top of the Coconut Mall start gate, but I wasn't really a fan of how the wreath looked here. So instead, I moved it back to the sign and replaced the middle O with it. I also changed it from smooth shading to flat shading, which is usually a terrible idea for low poly objects like this, but I think the jagged edges make it look more like a wreath than it did with the smooth shading. Now I can make Sianta, Piansta, Sanstiapna. I swapped the palm tree on his head for a Christmas tree with a little star on top. Then I put the color palette that I've been using on his clothes and made them look a little more Santa-like. I also separated and scaled up his hands a bit to give him some mittens, which I can then recolor with the color palette. Now I just need to try my best at modeling a beard. Sure. And as the final touch, I added some ornaments to the Christmas tree on his head. The next thing I want to do is going to be pretty tricky. I want to add a string of Christmas lights along the outside of the building, but I don't really know how to do that. I mean, I could always just place them by hand, but that would seriously suck. There's gotta be a better way to do this somewhat procedurally. I started off by heading over to this area and experimenting with curves. I'm fairly certain that this is how we're gonna make a string for the Christmas lights to sit on. I mostly knew how curves worked, but I had to watch a tutorial real quick to get a better understanding of how to use them. So basically, a curve is just a line that you can shape and use as a path for geometry. If you give it a depth value, you get a tube shape around the line, which is good enough for what we're we're trying to do. But now I need to make lights that will run along this wire and follow it when I make changes to it. So I made a light out of a low poly icosphere with an emissive material on it. Then I put an array modifier on it, so I can dynamically add lights at a fixed distance from one another. But how do I get them to follow the curve? I tried shrink wrapping them like I did with the snow on the palm leaves, but that didn't really go well. That's when I explored the deform modifiers a bit and found one called curve, which turned out to be exactly what I needed. I just selected the curve and it snapped on. It was kinda going way off the end though, so I just brought it back a bit and we're all set. Probably the best feeling in Blender is figuring out something useful mostly through your own experimentation. That or the feeling of your project not taking 3 minutes to save. So now that I've got some paths set up, I can hook the lights up to them. In retrospect, I think I made these lights a little too big, but they still ended up looking pretty nice. But I want them to give off light too, so I'm gonna need to set up some point lights. Let's get out of the cold and do a little interior decorating. I want to add strings of garland up in this open ceiling area, which are gonna be made out of curves just like the Christmas lights. I struggled for a while to find a good way to have pine needles travel along the curve, but I realized that using a fur simulation would probably work best. So I used the quick fur option and messed with the parameters a bit to get something a little more pine needly. Then I wrapped it around the pillar and duplicated it to the other side. There we go, that's pretty nice. But this banner doesn't really fit. I could just get rid of it, but I think I'll modify it instead. So I opened the sign texture that Coconut Mall uses for most of its signs. I ended up changing a few of these signs while I was in here, and for this one that sits by the garland, I made a candy cane pattern in Photoshop and separated the text and flower image from the background. That way I can underlay that pattern. There we go, I like that. The next thing I want to do is add a Christmas tree to the main room in place of the fountain. I think this open space with a high ceiling is just too perfect for that. I checked the model's resource just in case for a good Christmas tree, but as I sort of expected, there wasn't anything that would fit well. So it looks like I'm gonna have to make my own. I have made a tree before in Blender with the sapling tree gen add-on, but it wasn't great and it was pretty much just a default tree. So this is gonna be another learning experience. So the first thing I want to do is load the small pine preset. This will get me most of the way to a Christmas tree. Now it took a minute just to find that preset menu. There's a lot of parameters to change here, and I'm just gonna have to mess with them to find out exactly what they do. The first thing I messed with was the branch rings. I brought that number up a good ways to hopefully fill the tree out more. I don't think it's adding more branches, but it seems to be adding more resolution to where it can vertically place branches. And in the branch splitting section, I found this level option, which lets you choose how many times you want your branches to split. So I brought that up as well. And just to see how things would look in the end, I checked the show leaves option. Yeah, that's not really what I want. This is more of a Christmas bush. So let's try and give it more of a conical shape. I found some options for that in the pruning section. And after playing with all these settings, I got a much better Christmas tree shape. And with the pine needles enabled, this looks pretty awesome. I'm gonna have to put some materials on it, but that should be easy. And then I accidentally disabled the leaves and closed the creation menu that lets me bring them back. And F9 didn't reopen the menu for some reason.
My tree!
So what's the matter with you?
Look what you've done to my tree!
So I went ahead and remade the tree, which was easier now that I sort of knew what I was doing. Then I put a couple of materials on it and brought it inside, and I set a star on top from Merry Mountain. I ended up recoloring the wood a bit though, since it seemed a little too dark. Then I set up a bunch of presents underneath. Now I'm gonna replace the grass on the sides with snow and import some snowmen from Mario Kart 8. Alright, let's get some lights on the tree. This took a little while to adjust everything, but I think it looks pretty good. Then, to finish it off, I made some Christmas ornaments. I was able to select stripes on the icosphere and do a striped design with the color palette texture. After making a few designs and placing them on the branches, we've got a complete Christmas tree. Maybe you could use some sparkly tinsel or something like that, but I'll call it finished for now. And actually, that's probably where I should stop for this week. I want to do a little more to the first section with all of the storefronts next week, but really I mostly want to focus on the food court section, since I never decorated that section for Halloween, so it'll be a fun, fresh area to explore the Christmas theme in. Well anyways, I hope you guys are liking how this is turning out so far, and I hope you're having a great holiday season. I'll talk to you later. Thanks.